When we construct a social possibilities curve, we're using the tools of positive economics. We're asking, what will the income distribution be if we use different levels of government redistributive taxation? Once we have the social possibilities curve, we'll know what all the income distributions are that are actually possible. And at that point we can ask, of all the possible income distributions, which is the most desirable? Which is the one that the government should seek to implement through its policies? And as soon as we use the word should, we've crossed the boundary from positive economics to normative economics. Now we need an ethical criterion to choose what's more desirable and what's less desirable, which is why normative economics intersects with the discipline of philosophy. Now, back in the 1940s and 50s, some economists began to think about this problem, and they came up with a thought experiment. They said instead of thinking about what ethical criterion to use to think about society from our current positions in the world, we should pretend that we don't know where in the world we're going to end up, and ask ourselves from that position of uncertainty, what ethical criterion would we choose? Then in 1971, a philosopher named John Rawls wrote a book called The Theory of Justice, in which he named that thought experiment. He called it the veil of ignorance. Like the economists before him, he thought the right way to think about what ethical criterion we should come up with is to strip ourselves of knowledge of who we are in this world, to step behind the veil of ignorance that'll strip us of all that knowledge, of where we were born, who we were born to, how we were raised, what resources we had, what adversities we'd face. All of that knowledge is stripped away from us by the veil of ignorance. And it'll put us into what he called the original position. Not the position we occupy in real life, but the original position where all was yet to be determined. And then he challenged us to, from that original position, ask ourselves the question, what kind of society would we want to step into, not knowing what position in the world we'll occupy? And when he asked himself that question, he said he thought that most people would choose a society that seeks to make the least well-off as well-off as possible. Now, when you first look at that, you might think that John Rawls was simply proposing a society of complete equality. And in some cases, his criterion does imply that, but not always. So let's see what this criterion implies for what we would choose along these social possibility curves. And let's start with the one that emerges from efficient redistribution. Now, complete equality in these pictures emerges along the 45-degree line. If we put a 45-degree line into this picture, then along that line, the income for type 2 people is exactly the same as the income for type 1 people. So if we were to choose a point of complete equality along this social possibilities curve, it would be this point right here. Now we can check, does this in fact satisfy Rawls's criterion? Well, if we start at this point and move to the left, we're making type 1 people worse off. So they become the least well-off people, and they're becoming worse off. So we wouldn't want to move in this direction according to Rawls. We want to make the least well-off as possible. If we are moving to the right, on the other hand, we're making type 2 people less well-off. They become the least well-off people, and they're becoming worse off. So this point, in fact, does satisfy Rawls's criterion. The least well-off person is as well-off as possible. What about this social possibility curve? Let's put the 45-degree line in. This would be the point of complete equality along this social possibility curve. And we can then ask again, does that satisfy Rawls's criterion? If we move to the left, type 1 people become the least well-off people, and they're becoming worse off, just as they did here. If we move to the right, type 2 people become the least well-off, and they're becoming worse off, just as up here. So again, the point of complete equality is the point that Rawls's criterion would choose. But what about this social possibilities curve, which is probably the most realistic in the real world? Let's put the 45-degree line in here. Complete equality would imply that we choose this point on that social possibilities curve. But now, as we move to the right, both people are becoming better off. So we're making the least well off better off, which means Rawls would say we should not pick the point of complete equality. Even though inequality is emerging as we move to the right, the least well off person is becoming better off. And that's going to continue to be the case all the way until the peak here. Once we reach that peak, the least well off person will be the type 2 person. Type 2 people have less income here than type 1 people. If we moved any further to the right, type 2 people, the least well off, would become worse off. We wouldn't want to do that. We would want to stop here. That's the point Rawls's criterion would choose. So Rawls's criterion does not imply we're going to choose a society with full equality. In fact, Rawls recognized fully that in the real world we face constraints to how much we can redistribute. But he insisted that we should nevertheless make the least well-off person as well off as possible, even if that implies some inequality in the world. Now, Rawls's criterion is not the only criterion that we could imagine choosing from behind the veil of ignorance. And a lot of economists have pointed out that the criterion Rawls chose was one of extreme risk aversion. If you imagine choosing this criterion, you might be choosing it because you're worried that you might be the least well-off person, even though that's a really low probability event. So if we were less risk-averse behind the veil of ignorance, we might choose something less extreme as a criterion. Another extreme criterion we could choose, sort of at the other end of the spectrum, would be a criterion that says we just want a society where income is the largest it can possibly be overall. In that case, if we look at this social possibilities curve, every point would satisfy that criterion. We could start at this point where the economy puts us, and since we can redistribute income without cost, income along this line never actually falls, overall income in the society. So every point would in fact maximize overall income. But the same wouldn't be true here. The economy would put us here, and any redistribution, because we're using inefficient mechanisms for redistributing, would involve some deadweight loss. And that means that any redistribution will result in less overall income. So a criterion that says we want a society where income is maximized would choose not to redistribute at all in this case, or in this case. But again, there are lots of ethical criterion you could choose in between. But there's a larger question, which is this way of thinking about the problem even the right way? And there was another philosopher, a contemporary of John Rawls, and both were at the time professors at Harvard. They engaged in lots of debates, and this other philosopher's name is Robert Nozick. Now, Robert Nozick said Rawls has it all wrong in terms of how he thinks about what is just. Rawls is so focused on outcomes and judging whether the outcomes are just. He's a pure consequentialist. He's just looking at the consequences that we face in the world and saying, well, are these just or not? Nozick said, it doesn't really matter how much income inequality there is in the world. What matters is how it came to be. Did it come to be in a just way or in an unjust way? Imagine, Nozick might say, a world in which everyone has equal opportunity, and a world in which we make decisions under fair and just rules. If we start out with equal opportunity and we make all our choices under fair and just rules, then any outcome by definition is just, according to Robert Nozick, because the process that led to the outcome was just. You might, in an example that we had in an earlier module, choose to become a math teacher or an actuary. Actuaries make more money than math teachers do, but math teachers may have more satisfying lives than actuaries. People will make different choices, but the math teachers will make less income than the actuaries. Robin Nozick would say, if they had equal opportunity to begin with, and there are fair rules that govern the world, then the fact that the math teachers make less income than the actuaries is not a problem of social justice. It is a just outcome because the process that led to it was a just process. So one approach, Rawls's approach, focuses very much on the consequences, on the outcomes, and asks the question, are these outcomes just? Another approach says we shouldn't really focus on the outcomes so much as how we got to those outcomes, the process that led to them. And so those are two different ways that you could think about how much redistribution might we actually want governments to undertake.